Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers. So a few hours ago, posted a video talking about the cards from the Gruul Commander Precon deck for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Well, we got two decks coming with Kamigawa, so now it's time to talk about deck number 2, which is actually a really sweet one. This is a Azorius Vehicle Artifact deck. So we're going to break down all the new cards from that deck, and there's a lot of sweet ones, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Commander cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. One is, if you want to see the full deck list and all the spoilers, sortable, filterable, all that good stuff, head on over to mtgpreviews.com. Number 2, if you need some of these cards for your own, you can get them from our awesome sponsor, Card Kingdom, by heading to cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish and even get a free goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes, and they will hook you up. Anyway, let's talk one more time about Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Commander. Alright, so we already talked about all the cards in this super sweet Gruul deck. If somehow you missed that video that went up a few hours ago, I'll put a card, click on it, follow the link in the description. If you want to see Gruul stuff, that's where you will find it. So that means it's time to talk about our other Precon deck, our Azorius Vehicle / Artifact Precon deck. And this deck is led by Katori Pilot Prodigy. And we're not going to get into Katori. We talked about it in a spoiler video a few days ago, but it does kind of exemplify what the deck's about. The deck is all about vehicles, turning them into creatures, artifact shenanigans, and just generically good artifact stuff. So that's what you should expect in this deck. And like every Precon, we got two backup commanders, starting with, oh boy, I love this card, Shorikai Genesis Engine, a 4-mana 8/8 legendary vehicle. And I know what you're thinking, wait, vehicle? That can't be my commander. Well, it says right on the card it can be your commander. So this is the first ever vehicle that's legal as your commander. It has a crew cost of roughly infinite, 8. And then pay 1, tap it to draw 2 cards and discard a card and make a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token. With this creature crews vehicles, although its power was 2 or greater. So it can crew itself eventually. Like by itself, 3 turns of tapping it to draw cards and make pilots will eventually let you turn it on, since those pilots are pretty good at flying vehicles. So Shorikai is, oh my goodness, just a really sweet card. I mean, the big deal is, first ever vehicle commander. We've seen a few non-creatures be commanders in the past, mostly planeswalkers, I think exclusively planeswalkers. So this is actually a vehicle that it is creature-esque, but it's legal to be played as your commander, and I think this card is incredibly strong. So first off, as a vehicle, the big problem here is Crew 8 is a lot. Like, that is the biggest downside of Shorikai. It's even more expensive than Consulate Dreadnought. I'm pretty sure this is the highest crew cost we've ever seen on a vehicle, which means if the plan of your deck is to actually beat down with your commander, I think you're going to want ways to turn it into a creature that is not Crew 8. Like, Crew 8 is just too high. Thankfully, we got a lot of those. We got Katori, which just gives your vehicles Crew 2. We got Mech Hanger, a land that can do it. Peace Walker Colossus, New Tezzeret, Mobilizer Mech. There are plenty of ways to turn this into a creature without tapping 8 power worth of creatures. We also got a couple of new ones that are coming in these decks that we'll talk more about later. Katsumasa can animate vehicles. Cyberdrive Awakener can animate vehicles. So we have plenty of ways to turn this into a creature without tapping 8 power worth of creatures. So if you want to build around this as a beatdown commander, as a over-the-curve 4-mana 8/8, I think that's the direction you want to go, because Crew 8 is really high. For me, though, what makes this card so exciting is actually just its activated ability. A 4-mana vehicle that for 1 mana can Mask of Memory or Emissai's Tomb every single turn and make a 1/1 along the way means that this is actually kind of an insane commander, even outside of vehicle decks. Obviously, if you're playing a vehicle deck, it's a sweet vehicle to lead your deck, but this is just like a really solid blue-white control commander, blue-white value commander, blue-white reanimator commander. I think that might be the most exciting aspect of this, is we're getting all this white reanimation now, and we used to get it and then we didn't get it for a while. Now we're getting a bunch more, but like Invoke Justice and Late to Dinner, Brilliant Restoration, this is like the perfect leader for that deck. As a vehicle, it's kind of hard to kill because it's not going to be a creature to die a creature removal if you don't turn it on. It can make chump blockers to keep you alive while you're getting things set up, and its ability every single turn is generating card advantage and filling your graveyard, setting you up for reanimation. So one of the things I love in Commander is like color shifted decks. When I think Reanimator, I think black, I think red. I definitely don't think Azorius, but this is just a great leader for Azorius Reanimator. So if you want to try a really powerful archetype like Reanimator, but in a unique color combination, this is going to be one of, if not the best commander for your deck. It's also just a good blue-white control commander, like playing this with your Wraths and your counter spells, just generic Crim style deck. In Azorius, like, it's generating card advantage, it's making chump blockers, and then eventually maybe you turn it into an 8/8 and beat down. So I think this card is just great. It's great in the 99 of other vehicle decks. It is a really spicy vehicle that can be your commander, which is super unique. And if you just want to play like blue-white Reanimator, blue-white control, I honestly think this is just a really strong commander because that 1 mana tap to draw a card ability is really, really powerful. So all around, absolutely love this card. I think the first thing I'm going to do with it is build Azorius Reanimator, honestly, but there's a bunch of different directions you could go with this card. We also got Katsumasa, the Animator, and this card, maybe my least favorite of the new legends from this set. So 4 mana 3/3, legendary Moonfolk Artificer. You can pay 3 mana, and until end of turn, target non-creature artifact you control becomes an artifact with flying, and if it's not a vehicle, it has base power and toughness of 1/1 until end of turn. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you can put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 3 target non-creature artifacts. So this is a card that can turn your artifacts into creatures, and it can modify your non-creature artifacts with counters that then eventually you're going to hopefully turn into creatures. So I think this card is good at one thing in specific. If you want to play a vehicle deck, but you don't want to have a bunch of creatures for crewing your vehicles, Katsumasa is actually a really nice commander there. 3 mana, any of your vehicles turn into a creature. You can start beating down with them. A little bit awkward that it's mono blue, so it doesn't actually work with like Shorikai, unfortunately, but with colorless vehicles, with blue vehicles, this is a very good leader for that deck in specific. Otherwise, if you are not using vehicles, I feel like this was just bad Sidri. Like, Sidri is Esper, so you get more colors to work with, and for a 1 blue mana, target non-creature artifact becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness equal to its mana value until end of turn. So this can turn your mana rocks into creatures. This can turn any non-creature artifact into creatures for a single mana, for 2 less mana than Katsumasa, and Katsumasa is turning your creatures into 1/1s with flying. Sidri is potentially turning your Thran Dynamo into a 4/4, your Gilded Lotus into a 5/5. It's making them into much, much bigger creatures. So if you're turning anything except for vehicles into creatures, Sidri just feels way, way better for me. I will say, the one reason that Katsumasa is so good with vehicles is Sidri gives them power and toughness equal to their mana value. So your Mech Titan Core is going to be a 2/2. Your Heart of Kieran is going to be a 2/2. Katsumasa, the one thing that it does well is it makes your vehicles maintain their vehicle power, which is a big upside. That's why I like it as a vehicle commander. But otherwise, I think you just play Sidri. There are combos with this, like turn your Thran Dynamo into a creature and then untap it with Voltaic Construct to make infinite mana. But any combo that you can do with Katsumasa, you can do with Sidri just better and more efficiently. So I don't know if you like it for Moonfolk flavor or if you want it for your vehicle commander. It's a sweet card. Otherwise, I think it's just bad and less exciting because you got to stay in mono blue version of Sidri. We also got a kind of absurd one. In Swift Reconfiguration, 1 mana Aura has flash. You enchant a creature or vehicle. An enchanted permanent becomes a vehicle with crew 5 and loses all other card types. So 1 mana removal that doesn't actually kill the thing forever, essentially just turns it into a vehicle with a pretty high crew cost. So this card is exciting in 2 different ways. First off, it's just really good removal. It's Swords to Ride Chairs or Crash to Exile. Basically 1 mana vehicle-based removal. I think maybe a better comparison, if you don't have the bad vehicle puns, is maybe like Darksteel Mutation or even Imprisoned in the Moon, where you're turning your opponent's most powerful thing into a vehicle. It's not gone forever. Your opponent could still theoretically turn it back into a creature if they crew it up, but it's going to be a lot more difficult for your opponent to use, and since Switch Reconfiguration has flash, flash, you can do this as you're being attacked for lethal or whatever. You can flash it into play similar to Swords and Path to Exile. So as removal, this card is really good. What makes this card even more exciting though is its potential as a combo piece, using it on your own creature. So there's already been some infinite combos discovered. The most straightforward is just Devoted Druid. So the idea here, Devoted Druid, if you're not familiar with it, this 2-drop that taps to add a green mana, and then you can put a -1/-1 counter on it to untap it. So let's say we play Devoted Druid and we Swift Reconfiguration it. Now we have a Devoted Druid with all the same abilities, but rather than being a creature, it's a non-creature artifact. It's a vehicle. So we can tap Devoted Druid, put a counter on it to untap it, do it again and again and again. We could do that a million times. This vehicle non-creature artifact version of Devoted Druid, it can have as many counters as we want, and it's not going to die because it's not a creature. Of course, if we ever crewed it, then it would immediately die from all the -1/-1 counters. So this is essentially 2 cards, 3 mana, infinite mana, and even more importantly, and even more oddly, Swift Reconfiguration kind of gives our Devoted Druid haste, so non-creature artifacts are not affected by summoning sickness. So let's say we play Devoted Druid, and then we Swift Reconfiguration it. Creature form Devoted Druid can't tap for mana the first turn it comes into play because of summoning sickness, but once it's a non-creature artifact, we can start comboing off and tapping for mana right away. So that's really, really sweet. This could be a combo that, who knows, maybe even Legacy could play it. There's other versions of this combo with other cards that aren't quite as efficient, but still, this is a really, really scary combo to keep in mind. And if you're playing Swift Reconfiguration in your deck for removal and you're in the right colors, it'd be pretty easy to just toss this in as a weird backup combo that you stumble into sometimes for infinite mana. The other thing that I think is really hilarious about this card is its interaction with Planeswalkers, especially Planeswalkers that turn into creatures. Let's say Gideon of the Trials, or really any Gideon, but we turn Gideon into a creature, and then we Swift Reconfiguration it. This is going to give us a Gideon that's an artifact vehicle, but no longer a Planeswalker. And what this essentially means is we can still use all of Gideon's abilities. We can still emblem it. We could actually 0 it to turn it into a creature. We can +1 to prevent damage on things, but our opponent's not going to be able to attack it because it's not a Planeswalker anymore. It's a vehicle, and you can't attack a vehicle. That's not how Magic works. So this makes a Planeswalker really, really difficult to kill. Our opponent's going to have artifact removal, some removal that can kill a vehicle for them to actually be able to deal with our Planeswalker. So this is a way that we can just keep activating Planeswalkers over and over and over again with much less chance of it actually dying because it can't be attacked. Also worth mentioning, you can kind of use this to save a creature from removal in a really weird roundabout way. If you got some really important creature and your opponent wraths the board, you could flash this in and turn your creature into a vehicle to dodge your wrath, although then at the same time, you're going to be the one that kind of removed your own thing. Now you're going to need to crew your creature for it to actually become a creature again. So it is worth keeping in mind, there's just so many shenanigans here, from combos to being good removal to saving your own stuff in a pinch from some sort of Wrath or Sweeper. Swift Reconfiguration, I think one of just the most powerful cards from the set. We also got Research Thief, a 5-mana 3/3 flying Moonfolk Wizard artifact creature. It is flash, and it says whenever an artifact creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So Research Thief, I don't think it's very good. So I know. Last video, I was excited about Kami of Celebration, which is kind of similar as a 5-mana 3/3 that when a modified creature attacks, you get to exile a card and cast it. Research Thief is kind of the mirror image of this for the other deck. So why was I hyped about Kami of Celebration, but think Research Thief is pretty bad? There's a couple of reasons. One is Kami of Celebration, part of the reason we were hyped for it is its synergy with exile-based decks. Research Thief doesn't really have that synergy. The bigger problem is this effect is really common in blue. I know it compares kinda to like a bad Toski, but if you look at what blue has, you got Biden Athasa, you got Coastal Piracy, you got Reconnaissance Mission, you got Deep Fathom Skulker. There's a lot of cards in blue that essentially do what Research Thief does, but do it in a less fragile way by being a non-creature, or do it for all your creatures. Research Thief only triggers on artifact creatures. Biden Athasa, Coastal Piracy, all these other cards, they trigger on any creature, which just makes them so much more flexible. So it's hard for me to see a reason to play Research Thief. Like, even if you're an artifact-based deck, wouldn't Bidnathasa or Coastal Piracy be better? Maybe, I guess the argument is you, like, make a bunch of 1/1 flyers in attack and your opponent chooses not to block, and you can flash this in and get them by surprise thanks to the flash aspect. But really, Research Thief to me, it's like just kind of a worse version of effects that we already have in the same colors. So, I don't know, play it for fun, play it for flavor purposes, but I don't think it's a card you play because it's optimal. We also got Imposter Mech, a really interesting new vehicle. So 2-mana 3/1 vehicle, it crews for 3, and it says you may have Imposter Mech enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature an opponent controls, except it's a vehicle artifact with crew 3 and loses all card types. So Imposter Mech, this is a weird one. It's essentially a phantasmal image, but it has a restriction that I don't think has ever been put on a clone effect before, which is you can only copy your opponent's things, which makes it harder to build around, essentially. You can't play things that you want to copy. You got to trust that your opponent's going to be playing good things to copy. At the same time, there are some upsides to being a vehicle. As we talked about before, when we were talking about turning your stuff into a vehicle, Imposter Mech, it's unaffected by summoning sickness in vehicle form. So if you copy someone's Birds of Paradise or Circle of Dream Druids, you can just immediately tap it for mana. And, I mean, it works with Enter the Battlefield triggers. You copy someone's Dockside or Solemn or Avengers Zendikar, you're still going to get that trigger. You're still going to make a whole bunch of plants or a whole bunch of treasures. So that's another upside there as well. And it keeps the abilities, which is actually kind of quirky and cool. Like a card like Notion Thief, really, really powerful. It's also really fragile, and people are going to try to kill it. If you get a vehicle copy of it, it's going to be much harder for most decks to kill. Same with Scarab God, or imagine a Scoot Swarm. There's actually just a random artifact vehicle sitting on the battlefield. Every land drop you make, you're going to be making more copies of it or more tokens, but you're not actually going to have to risk it dying. Or same with Toski not being a creature, so it can't get hit by Swords to Plowshares. So there's certainly a bunch of upsides to having your creature actually be a vehicle. On the other hand, you are just completely dependent on what's in your opponent's deck. You can't put Notion Thief in your deck and clone it, or Scoot Swarm in your deck and clone it, because that's not how Imposter Mech works. So we'll have to wait and see. I think this card's really fun. I definitely plan on playing it. And it really depends on your play group. If people are playing good cards that you want to copy, this is going to be just about as efficient as a clone can be. We've never gotten clones less than 2 mana, so this is as cheap as it gets, and you got some upsides for having it be a vehicle. On the other hand, if, I don't know, all your play groups playing birds and playing skeletons and just really horrible stuff that you don't really want to copy, then this card gets a lot worse. But still, 2 mana clone with a bunch of weird upsides and a vehicle to boot, definitely worth keeping in mind. We also got Cyberdrive Awakener, which seems like a great finisher for non-creature artifact decks. 6 mana 4/4 flying construct. Other artifact creatures you control have flying, and when it enters the battlefield, until end of turn, each non-creature artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness of 4/4. So on one hand, this ability isn't unique. Tezzeret the Seeker turns all your artifacts into 5/5s until end of turn. The Antiquities War turns them into 5/5s until end of turn. In some ways, Cyberdrive Awakener is actually worse. It only hits non-creature artifacts. It only makes them into 4/4s. However, there's a huge upside here. Everyone can see Tezzeret the Seeker and Antiquities War coming. Cyberdrive Awakener just comes down and does this all by itself, one shot, ETB trigger, which is really scary. So it's not going to work in decks with creatures. Keep that in mind. You got to have non-creatures, but in a deck that's full of non-creature artifacts, and I hate to make this comparison, this is almost like a Crater Hoof Behemoth. Like, if you have a bunch of mana rocks and other non-creature artifacts, this just comes down and kills people. I don't think it's actually quite as scary as Crater Hoof. It doesn't give trample, but it does give flying. But really, if you get a bunch of random artifacts laying around, sending them to the air and smashing your opponent with them is probably going to take someone out and maybe just close out the game altogether. So as I mentioned before, everyone's playing mana rocks. This works really well with those. Like, this is a payoff. Just play as many mana rocks as possible and then tutor this up and turn your mana rocks into creatures and smash someone to death. So that by itself is really good. It works really well with any commander that can make artifact tokens, like Eloise or Lannis or Targo making a bunch of rock tokens, anything like that you can just flood the board with cheap non-creature artifacts. Cyberdrive Awakener is going to be really good. So outside of those dedicated like token decks, Sidri and Silas and Emery and Joyra. There's a lot of decks that this can see play in, and I expect this to be a really popular finish for decks that just have a lot of non-creature artifacts. Like if you're playing the Eloise deck, if you're playing the Lana's deck, or any deck that just has a whole bunch of non-creature artifacts, this is about as close as your deck's gonna get to having a hoof to just close out the game in one attack. We also got Release to Memory, which weird card to show up in this artifact precon. Not a bad card. 4-mana instant. Exile target opponent's graveyard for each creature exiled this way. Make a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. Not really sure what this has to do with the rest of the theme of the deck. Reminds me a little bit of Kaya Geist Hunter's Ultimate, except it only has one graveyard, or Necromancer's Covenant, except a lot less expensive, but you're only getting 1/1s. Essentially, you wipe a graveyard and you get a bunch of spirits. Is this card worth playing? I think the answer is only if you're a Spirits deck, even though I'm a big believer that we should probably play more Graveyard Hate in Commander. We talk about this all the time. I don't think I would just play this as Graveyard Hate, but if I'm a Spirit deck who can actively take advantage of the creature type like Melisson or Kaika or Geist Saint Traft or Hoffrey, giving them all haste and, trampling and pumping them, then this card seems pretty good. If you think of this as, okay, this is making a bunch of tokens for my tribe, rather than, oh, this is Graveyard Hate, then I think this card becomes much, much more appealing, because if you think about it, like Spectral Possession is 3 tokens for 3 mana. Lingering Souls, you pay 3 and then 2 to get 4 tokens. If you can get somewhere in the 3 to 4 token range with Release to Memory at instant speed, that's definitely worth the mana cost. And there's going to be times when you draw this in the late game and someone has a full graveyard, and you just end up making a ridiculous amount of tokens, like 10 or 20 tokens, and swinging the game in your favor. So Release to Memory, powerful effect. Playing more Graveyard Hate is good, but I think I'd really want to be a Spirit Tribal deck before I actually put this in my deck. We also got Aerial Surveyor, a new white vehicle, a 3-mana 4/3 flyer. This says when it attacks, if defending player controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic Plains card and put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So this is land taxi, I guess, if we're sticking with the vehicle puns. Essentially, it's Cartographer's Hawk, except it doesn't bounce itself back to its hand and it's in vehicle form. Actually, this might be the card that makes Cartographer's Hawk good, because you can use your bad Cartographer's Hawk to crew your good Aerial Surveyor and start ramping. But Aerial Surveyor, we've seen a ton of cards like this. This is how white traditionally ramps. I think this is actually one of the best versions of the effect. Is it as good as Archaeomancer's Map? Is it as good as Keeper of the Cord? Maybe not, but I still think that this is going to see a lot of play in white decks. White decks usually have cheap creatures for crewing. You can choose who you're attacking, so you can attack someone who does have more lands than you. And if you're getting a land every turn out of this, especially in the early game, this is going to catch you up with a green player really quickly. It's going to keep you ahead in resources. So I like Aerial Surveyor. I think this is essentially what Cartographer's Hawk wanted to be. You don't have the janky bounce back to your hand shenanigans and all those issues. This is just a pretty much on-curve vehicle that can be a reasonable body in the air, and if you attack the right person, do a bunch of ramping. So really good for white decks everywhere. We also got Drumbellower, and this is probably one of the better white cards we've seen in a while. 2-mana, 2/1 flying spirit, and it says untap all creatures you control during each other player's untap step. So on level 1, it gives you vigilance. You can attack and untap your stuff, so it's back on defense, but this card does way more than that. We've seen similar versions of this. It's like a third of Prophet of Krufix, or a white Merkfield Liege, or an Awakening that doesn't impact your opponents, but we have not seen a card like this in white that I'm aware of. So this is a pretty unique effect in white, and this can do a lot of interesting things. So the most exciting thing, and I know, I'm very, very evil, but what I want to do with this card is play it with Opposition in a token deck. Opposition, one of my favorite cube cards. Never actually played it in Commander, I don't think, at least not in a long time, but it's 4-mana enchantment, and it says tap an untapped creature you control to tap an artifact, creature, or land. So the idea is you essentially make a bunch of tokens with Increasing Devotion or Spectral Procession, and then on your opponent's upkeep, you tap down all of their lands. You tap a creature, tap a land, tap a creature, tap a land. Your opponent could cast an instant if they have one, but essentially they're going to more or less skip their turn. And then you go to the next person's turn, you untap all your stuff thanks to Drumbellower, and you do the same thing. On their upkeep, you tap all their lands, tap all their creatures, and do it again. And then when you get to your turn, you make some more tokens so you can tap even more stuff, and you just keep locking everyone out of the game pretty much forever. So that's what Drumbellower screams out for me. Obviously, your playgroup's going to hate you, probably kick you out, but if you want to make everyone miserable, opposition's going to get the job done. If you want to do something similar but not have everyone hate you, Glare of Subdual can also do it. Does something similar, but it only hits artifacting creatures. It's basically opposition, except you can't tap down your opponent's land, so they still get to play magic, which is a good or bad thing. I don't know. It depends on your perspective. But those are some of the obvious synergies. Also pretty cute with the Inspired mechanic. Inspired triggers when a creature becomes untapped, like King Makar, making gold and exiling stuff. Arbiter of the Ideal, jamming stuff into play with manifestation counters. You can use a vehicle, let's say, to continually tap your stuff. Crewing, one of the upsides of it, is it can tap creatures. So you have your Smuggler's Copter, you tap your King Makar and your Arbiter of the Ideal. Upkeep, Drumbellow's going to untap them, then you tap them again and do that every upkeep. That's a lot of repeatable value. Plus, there's some commanders that have tap abilities that this fits in really well. Gen for even more reanimation, Atla Pellini for more eggs, Captain Sisse, tutor legend every single turn. Your turn, your opponent's turn, your next opponent's turn, your next opponent's turn. You're going to speedrun Garth One-Eyed and just get all the cards really quick. You can keep untapping Urtai to counter stuff with its sacrifice ability. And then there's non-legendary cards, or cards that you can't play as legends because of color considerations, that care about things being tapped or untapped, like Ancestor's Prophet, the whitest way to do this. Tap 5 clerics you control, gain 10 life. If you got 5 clerics, you can tap them all every turn. That's going to be 40 life each turn cycle. Or if you want to be meaner, Patron Wizard, tap an untapped wizard you control, counter a spell unless its controller pays 1. Basically a mana tithe or a force spike. But you can do that again and again and again if you're untapping your creatures each turn, or Izami for card draw, or Galecaster Colossus for bouncing, or Abyshin for tapping down permanent opposition style. So there's a lot of shenanigans here. And if you want to go non-creature style, like Hairstring Kodo, tap an untapped creature, mill for 1. Earthcrap, Cryptolith Rites, tons of mana. Tap all your stuff for mana, untap it each turn, make even more mana, cast some instants. So Drumbellower, this card seems kind of busted to me. Power level wise, I think this might be pretty high in the list of best cards from the entire Commander Precon set from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. This card I think is going to be a new white staple. I think it's going to see it play in a lot of decks. It opens up synergies and combos. Some of them are mean, some of them are just fun and janky. But regardless, this is a card that I think we're going to see in a lot of Commander decks. Really, really powerful, especially for just 3 mana. We also got Ironsoul Enforcer, 5 mana 4/4 artifact human samurai, and it says when it or a commander you control attacks, return target artifact card from your graveyard to your battlefield. So this is a Sun Titan refurbish, essentially, with the upside of triggering on your commander attack as well, which kind of gives this, hey, so you can play your commander, play this, attack it with your commander, get back in artifact, and I think this card's actually just pretty good. It's a card I would play in pretty much any artifact deck, and definitely any artifact deck like Oswald or Osgir that's about sacking artifacts, because then you're probably going to have a graveyard full of artifacts for this to get it back. But I think any deck that's just built around artifacts, and remember, this doesn't even say artifact creatures, you can get back any artifact. So you can be getting back your Solemn Simulacrum, or you can be getting back God Pharaoh's Gift, or whatever big non-creature artifact. But I think you just jam this in any artifact deck and use it as a Sun Titan for repeated reanimation, getting back Worm Coils and Battle Spheres and Combustible Gearhulks or Triplicate Titans, whatever big crazy artifacts you want. So pretty good card. I mean, Sun Titan is still good enough, and while this isn't quite as big, and it does die to artifact destruction, in an artifact deck, seems like a really powerful source of recursion. We also got a few new Improvise cards. So Improvise, Artifact Convoke, essentially get to tap artifacts to reduce the cost of the spell by 1. So first off, we got Universal Surveillance, triple blue and X, Improvise, draw X cards. So this compares to Blue Sun Zenith, Brain Geyser. The biggest issue is it is sorcery speed. That is a drawback. So it makes it more like Brain Geyser than Blue Sun Zenith. Also, you can't target your opponent with it, which is worth keeping in mind. That's kind of a fringe thing, but sometimes you mill your opponent out with a Blue Sun Zenith or whatever. So that is the drawback. It is sorcery speed. The upside is you can draw a ton of cards with this. If you're in an artifact deck, being able to tap all your random artifacts to draw additional cards is really, really strong. My main concern is if you're doing this during your main phase and dumping all your mana into this, you're probably just going to discard a ton of cards to hand size. So make sure you got your Reliquary Tower or whatever to not have to discard to hand size, and that you're in a position where you're not going to die on the backswing if you spend all your mana during your turn just to refill your hand and not impact the board. But this is a card that can draw a ridiculous amount of cards. I think this will shine the most in go-wide artifact-based decks. I'm thinking like Psymaster Thopterus. Whenever you get an artifact, you get a Thopter that's an artifact. Tapping those Thopters, that is a ton of cards that can be drawn. Eloise makes a ton of clues. Brea can make a ton of Thopters. So in this style of deck, Universal Surveillance might actually be better than something like Blue Sun Zenith. It's also really cute with artifact-based tokens that are not creatures. Something like Lannis, for example, makes a ton of clue tokens. Maybe you can make a bunch of food tokens. Maybe you can make a bunch of blood tokens. When all of your food or clues or blood are tapping for a mana thanks to Improvise, they become much, much more powerful. So there's a lot of possibilities here for Universal Surveillance. So this is a card that, in a generic deck, it's not worth it. There's better options that are at instant speed. In an artifact deck, that's where it becomes interesting, I would say. I'm still actually not 100% sure if I'd rather have this or something like Blue Sun Zenith. The sorcery speed part does really scare me, but the amount of cards this can draw thanks to Improvise is really, really powerful. Just keep in mind with all these Improvise cards, Improvise is a little bit of a non-bill with Mana Rocks. If you're thinking, oh, okay, like my deck is going to have some artifacts because I play Mana Rocks, so I'm going to have some amount of artifacts, I should play these Improvise cards. Remember that Mana Rocks just tap for mana, so Improvise is kind of redundant if your artifacts are already making literal mana, so it doesn't really work that way. It needs to be in a dedicated artifact deck, but in a dedicated artifact deck, gonna draw you a lot of cards. We also got Organic Extinction, a 10 mana Wrath that has Improvise and destroys all non-artifact creatures. So Organic Extinction, it looks really expensive. In some ways, it reminds me of Vanquish the Horde, that if you just read the mana cost, you're like, oh my god, that's so expensive, I'll never play it. But it's actually often going to be 2 mana. In the decks that'll play this, you should have enough random artifacts sitting around that you can tap them, and then you're getting like a creature-only version of Scourglass. If you are playing an artifact deck, this is actually way better than Vanquish the Horde, because you're probably not going to kill your creatures. It can turn into a Plague Wind, essentially, where you're blowing up all your opponent's creatures, but you're keeping your creatures because they're artifacts. Doing that for maybe 2 mana thanks to Improvise is really powerful. So I think in decks that have a lot of artifact creatures, this is going to be a staple Wrath. Like, I would play this #1 over Wrath of God, over Toxic Deluge, over Vanquish the Horde. You name a Wrath, this is going to be better in those specific decks. So if you're playing Sharam or Sidri or Zabaz or Loshil, anything that's going to have a lot of artifact creatures on the battlefield, this is probably the first Wrath you should put in your deck. And I know what you're thinking. Well, remember, this only says non-artifact creatures. So what if my opponent has artifact creatures? Maybe this won't be a true Wrath. And that is true. It isn't going to blow up your opponent's artifact creatures, and if you're in a play group where you know someone else is playing an artifact deck, then this is going to get worse. But in general, if you just look at the most played cards in Commander, the most played creatures in Commander, there's not that many artifacts to worry about. Like, sure, maybe you're going to miss a Solemn once in a while, maybe someone's got a Baleful Strix, maybe an Esper Sentinel, but a huge percentage of the creatures that are commonly played in Commander are non-artifacts. Artifacts see a ton of play, like Mana Rock style artifacts and equipment style artifacts, but artifact creatures just aren't a huge part of the Commander metagame, so I would not be worried about that really at all, unless you know there's like a bunch of artifact players in your playgroup and you're going to run into it consistently. Then maybe this gets worse. In general, though, if you are an artifact deck, I think this is the best Wrath for your deck. Like, it's cheap, it's not going to kill your stuff, it should kill most of your opponent's stuff. For 2 mana, a Plague Wind for an artifact deck is kind of absurd. I've talked about this before. When I play Wraths in Commander, I want them either to be really efficient or really flexible, and in many ways, this is both. It is efficient because with Improvise, you can cast it for 2 mana, and it's flexible because it's not going to blow up your creatures. It's just going to get your opponent's stuff if you're playing an artifact deck, which I think makes this card really, really strong, but only for a narrow amount of decks, so certain artifact-based decks. Otherwise, you got way better options. We also got Kappa Cannoneer, a new Turtle Warrior, 6 mana 4/4 with Improvise, and Ward 4, which Ward 4 is actually, that's something. A lot of times I kind of scoff at Ward a little bit, like Ward 1, Ward 2, it's like more of an annoyance than something that actually matters, but Ward 4, that's enough that it's gonna hurt for your opponent to actually kill this with targeted removal. And then it says when an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Kappa Cannoneer, and it can't be blocked this turn. So this card, I mean, it's essentially Bastion Inventor, except it's going to grow pretty quickly. And remember, it says when an artifact enters the battlefield, it itself is an artifact. So it's essentially going to come into play as a 5/5 with a +1/+1 counter and ward 4. So it's similar to Bastion Inventor, except it's going to grow. Also reminds me a little bit of Herald of Anguish, is this big, expensive top-end threat that's actually often going to be really, really cheap, thanks to Improvise. And I think this card actually is really powerful for the right deck. And again, I'm mostly looking at decks that can repeatedly make artifact tokens, like the Eloise combo. If you've ever seen Eloise go infinite, it makes infinite clue tokens, which are artifacts. If you have Kappa Cannoneer, that's going to make your Kappa Cannoneer infinitely powerful and unblockable, so you just one-shot someone. Or if you've ever seen Psy go off, where you're slinging a bunch of cheap artifacts that are making Thopters, every artifact is kind of 2 artifacts, your Kappa Cannoneer is quickly going to grow into a 10/10, a 20/20, a 30/30. Like, that is a very legitimate plan. Or Lannis making a ton of clue tokens. So there are a lot of ways to make this into a really legitimate threat. I don't think I would just play this in a random generic artifact deck where you're just kind of, you know, got an artifact sub-theme, you're casting a Solemn and a Warden Coil Engine, but in decks that can actively go wide with artifacts, like the ones we're talking about here, this is a really, really solid finisher. As far as playing it in other decks, that's where it gets a little bit sketchy. I could see Breya, because Breya just makes 3 bodies by itself. That's 3 artifacts, that's 3 counters on Kappa. Maybe like Joyra, if you're trying to combo off with cheap artifacts. Urza, depending on your build. So I think that this is a card that in the right deck, all-star, great finisher, but not even every artifact deck is going to be the right deck for Kappa Cannoneer. So keep that in mind. The more artifacts you can make, the better it gets. It can be a one-shot kill threat. Ward 4 is enough to hopefully protect it in a lot of situations. So the turtle can be a good way to close out the game, but only in the right deck. We also got Access Denied, a 5 mana counter spell. This says counter target spell, create X/1/1 colorless Thopter artifact tokens with flying, where X is the spell's mana value. So Access Denied, this is kind of a traditional counter spell with upside. We've seen, going all the way back to the early days of Magic, 5 mana counters that do something more than just counter the spell. Desertion, counter a spell. If it's an artifact or creature, you get to put it into play. Spell Swindle, counter it, get treasure tokens equal to its mana value. In these cards, they can be fun, but normally they aren't very good. Spell Swindle does see a little bit of play, and honestly, I think in like 99.9% of decks, if I did want this effect, this 5 mana counter that's going to make some amount of artifact tokens, I think I would rather just have treasure tokens than Thopter tokens a huge percentage of the time. So, Access Denied, I think this card is honestly borderline unplayable. The problem with all these cards, and when I first started playing Commander, I put Desertion in a lot of decks because it's just a cool card. You cast it and you get to steal the thing that it hits, and you're able to get it into play under your control. It's really, really fun to resolve a Desertion. The problem is, it's just so hard to leave up 5 mana for a counter spell. Unless you're playing some sort of flash deck that can actively like play on your opponent's turn, leaving up 5 mana is just really, really brutal. It's just more than you can afford to leave up for the most part. So unless you have a very specific build, like maybe Birdiclad would care so much about having the tokens on the battlefield because it does such crazy things with it, that it would be worth it in Birdiclad. Or maybe like Urza, the Thopters all make mana, so it becomes really, really powerful in a shell like that. So in those specific decks, it still could be worth the cost, but in general, I don't think you just play this as a counter for value. It's just too much mana. The other place I could potentially see it seeing home is in dedicated flying decks. Something like Iniaz, which just really cares about flyers, steals stuff when you attack with a bunch of flyers. Or Kangi is really good at pumping flyers. So if you're like flying tribal, one card that puts 5 flyers on the battlefield or something is a pretty powerful effect. So Access Denied, don't just run this in your counter spell slot. Seriously, an actual counter spell would be more powerful than this in just a generic deck. Like, it's just too much mana. You can't afford to just leave up 5 mana in Commander turn after turn after turn in hopes of hitting something good. But if you are one of those decks that can actively take advantage of having some Thopters. Again, Urzas, again, the Iniazes, the Burdiclads, those specific archetypes, then this is a card that is worth considering at the very least, even though I expect even in something like Burdiclad, I would rather make treasure tokens than Thopter tokens most of the time. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers for today. So what do you think? Which of these two decks is your favorite? What's your favorite card from this deck? Wow, these commander cards look really sweet. I gotta say, I think Wizards did a pretty good job with these ones. There's a lot of really powerful and fun looking cards, a lot of new stuff that has me excited to build new decks, but I don't see a Dockside Extortion. Is there something else that's going to be obviously broken and problematic? But let me know what you think. What deck you hyped for? What cards are you hyped to build around? What legends are going to lead your decks? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. And even though we're at the end of Kamigawa spoiler season, don't worry, there's a ton more Kamigawa to come. We got Commander podcasts coming up with our favorite cards from this set. We got top 10 videos, gameplay videos, Commander Clash featuring the new cards once they're out online. So much Kamigawa yet to come. So thanks for watching this spoiler season, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.